Being home alone never scared Jake. He was used to the quiet hum of an empty house, the distant creaks of settling wood, the soft patter of wind against the windows. Nights like these were routine, late hours, glowing screens, the muffled sounds of video games filling the space where conversation should be. But tonight something is different. It starts with a noise outside his door, so soft it could have been ignored, so deliberate that it can't be. A slow shuffle, a scrape against the wood, a breath that isn't his. Then the doorknob twitches. He calls out, expecting his dog, expecting anything to explain what he already knows isn't right, but the scratching stops. The air feels heavier, the space around him tighter, like the house itself is closing in. And when he finally looks toward the mirror, his own reflection is already watching him. The wrongness doesn't come all at once. It unspools in pieces, a shadow moving where there shouldn't be one, a whisper slipping through the phone speaker when the line is dead, the reflection that doesn't move when he does, the stretched, unnatural smile staring back at him before he even realizes his own mouth isn't open. The doors don't lead where they should. The walls feel closer. The house isn't just different, it's wrong. Something is here, something that doesn't break in because it doesn't have to. It's always been waiting. And as reality shifts, twisting into something unrecognizable, Jake is left with one question he doesn't want to answer. Is he trying to escape, or has the house already decided he belongs to it? Because in a house full of mirrors, the real nightmare isn't what's looking back, it's what happens when your reflection wants out. Jake never minded being home alone. At 16, he was used to it. His parents traveled often for work, and with Buddy, his golden retriever, as his only companion, the house never felt too empty. He enjoyed the solitude, the chance to play video games late into the night without anyone telling him to go to bed. Tonight was no different, or at least it should have been. Wrapped in the glow of his monitor, the rest of his room swallowed in darkness, he barely noticed the hours slipping by. His headphones were snug over his ears, the only sounds filling them being the chatter of his online teammates and the distant gunfire of the game. His fingers moved fluidly across the controller, his eyes locked onto the screen, until something outside the game made him pause. A noise, faint at first, soft, a slow, deliberate scratching. Jake pulled off his headset, suddenly aware of how quiet the house had become. The distant hum of the wind outside, the gentle creaks of an old house settling, these were normal, but the sound he just heard, that wasn't. His pulse thudded in his ears as he strained to listen. At first there was nothing, just silence thick enough to make his breath feel loud. Then again, scrape, 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 slow, uneven. Right outside his bedroom door, he turned toward it, heart beginning to pound against his ribs. His gaze dropped to the narrow gap between the bottom of the door and the floor, his stomach twisting when he noticed something shifting in the dim light leaking from the hallway. Shadows, not the flickering kind cast by a TV glow. These moved, shifted, hovered, his breath hitched. He clenched the controller in his hands, his mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be Buddy. The dog sometimes pawed at his door, especially when there was a storm outside. But then, wasn't Buddy outside? Hadn't he let him into the backyard earlier? He hesitated before calling out, voice tight, Buddy. The moment the name left his lips, the scratching stopped. Dead silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. His skin prickled as the air in the room suddenly felt heavier, colder, like the warmth had been sucked out of it. His fingers twitched against the controller, gripping it like a lifeline. Buddy always barked when he heard his name. He would have scratched again, let out a small whimper, nudged the door with his nose. But there was nothing, just an unnatural, expectant stillness. Then, just as he considered standing up, the sound changed. Click, 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 a rhythmic tapping against the wood. Slow, calculated, like nails. Jake swallowed hard, dread crawling up his spine. Something wasn't right. His pulse spiked as the noise shifted yet again. This time a soft, almost hesitant rattle. His stomach plummeted. The doorknob twisted just slightly, the latch clicking softly in the frame. Something was trying to open it. Jake didn't move. He barely breathed. His body had locked up completely, every muscle stiff as ice. His mind screamed at him to do something, grab his phone, grab anything, but he couldn't bring himself to move. He could see the knob shifting, the metal barely trembling under unseen fingers, not violently, not forcefully, but with a patience that chilled him to his core. It knows I'm in here. Then, like a switch had flipped, the movement stopped. No more scratching, no more rattling, nothing, just the wind outside, and his own ragged breathing. He sat there frozen in place, watching the door like it might lunge at him. His ears strained for any sign of footsteps, a retreating presence, anything, but there was only silence, a silence that didn't belong. His mind raced. Maybe it was his parents, maybe they had come home early, but that thought was immediately crushed. His mom would have called, his dad would have knocked, not whatever that was. And if it was Buddy, he was supposed to be outside. And then, like a sharp needle piercing through his thoughts, he remembered something that made his blood turn ice cold. Before his parents left earlier that evening, his mom had checked the doors. She had locked every single one. Jake sat frozen, staring at the door, his ears straining for any sound beyond the thick silence pressing against the walls. His fingers twitched, hovering over the controller, but his mind was far from the game now. The air in his room felt different, heavier, colder, like something unseen had seeped through the cracks and settled around him. He forced himself to breathe, slow and steady, but even that felt unnatural, like the room itself was listening. He didn't move, not at first. He just watched, waited. The doorknob no longer twitched. The shadows beneath the door were gone, but the feeling remained. The thick, gut-churning sensation that something was still there, standing just beyond the threshold, waiting for him to make the next move. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. He thought about calling his parents, but they were hours away. Thought about calling the cops, but what would he say? Hey, there was some scratching at my door, but now it stopped. They'd write it off as nothing, tell him to check the locks and hang up. But Jake knew this wasn't nothing. He knew what he had heard. Slowly he forced himself to move, muscles tight and rigid, like his body resisted the very idea of standing. His chair creaked as he pushed back from the desk, the sound slicing through the heavy silence. He hesitated, then reached for his phone, the screen glowing as he checked the time, 1:34 a.m. Too late to be imagining things. Too late for this to be anything normal. He pulled up the security app his parents had installed, one of those motion-detecting systems linked to the cameras outside. His thumb hovered over the feed. His breath felt too loud in the quiet. Then he tapped. The front porch cam loaded first, nothing but the empty snow-dusted driveway. Then the backyard, faint movement, the wind shifting the trees, the side yard, just the trash cans, and a dimly lit path. And then, finally, the front door camera. The feed flickered, the static clearing just enough for him to see. Jake's stomach dropped. The porch light buzzed, casting a faint yellowish glow onto the welcome mat. The front door was still shut, still locked exactly how it should be, but there was something else, something just out of view, half hidden by the frame of the doorway. A shape, a shadow that shouldn't be there, positioned in the blind spot where the camera couldn't fully capture it. Not moving, not leaving, just standing there, watching. Jake swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the phone. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs, his breath coming faster now. He squinted, tilting the phone, hoping for a better angle, but the figure remained just out of reach, as if it knew where to stand to avoid being fully seen. His skin prickled with something deeper than fear, something primal. He forced himself to look away, switching to another camera, another angle. Nothing. He went back to the feed. The shadow was gone. Jake quote. His breath hitched. His hand tightened around the phone so hard. His knuckles ached. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, the only sound breaking the suffocating quiet of the house. He turned toward his bedroom door again, his mind racing. If it had been outside, then what the hell had been inside? Scratching at his door. His pulse spiked. He stood quickly, his desk chair rolling back as he moved toward the door. His hand hovered over the knob, the memory of it twisting on its own, sending a fresh wave of unease through him. He hesitated, then pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. He swallowed and reached for the lock, flipping it. A small click echoed, too loud in the stillness. He braced himself and opened the door just a crack, just enough to see. The hallway stretched out before him, dark, untouched, no sign of anything, but the air smelled different, faintly off, like the way a room smelled when someone had just left it. He took a shaky step forward, his socks silent against the hardwood. The dim light from the living room cast long shadows across the walls, and his mind played tricks on him, making them seem like they moved when they shouldn't. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. It was fine. The house was empty. Buddy was outside. He was alone. Then something shifted at the far end of the hall. Jake's breath caught. A shape, not large, not human. Small but wrong, hunched just at the edge of the dim light, where the hallway met the living room. His pulse spiked, his entire body locking up as he struggled to process what he was seeing. It wasn't moving, but he could feel it watching him. And then, with slow, deliberate movement, it dragged itself back into the shadows and disappeared. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the thing at the end of the hall vanished into the darkness, swallowed whole by the shadows beyond the dim glow of the living room. His legs locked in place, his hands cold and clammy at his sides, his pulse thudding so hard in his ears that for a second he thought he might be imagining it. But he wasn't. He knew he wasn't. The way it had moved, slow and deliberate, dragging itself out of sight, it hadn't been human, hadn't been Buddy, hadn't been anything that should be inside his house. His fingers twitched at his sides, his body screaming for him to move, to turn back, to lock himself inside his room and pretend he had never seen it. But his curiosity, his sheer disbelief pushed him forward, one foot slipping silently in front of the other. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, every shadow seeming to pulse with something unseen, something shifting just beyond his vision. He forced himself to breathe, swallowing the lump in his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hello." The word barely left his lips before the house creaked, a deep groaning sound that didn't come from the wind outside, didn't come from the settling of the old floorboards. It came from something moving somewhere beyond the hallway. He stiffened. He wasn't alone. His gaze darted toward the living room, his mind racing, trying to recall if he had left any lights on, but he was certain he hadn't. The glow spilling in was faint, unnatural, coming from something outside, filtering through the curtains. His hand hovered over the light switch beside him, but something deep in his gut told him not to flip it, like somehow acknowledging the darkness would make it worse. Instead, he took another cautious step forward, the air growing heavier, thicker, almost like wading through water. The living room was just beyond the hall, the furniture barely outlined in the dimness, the silence pressing down on him like something tangible. He reached the threshold, his fingers gripping the wooden frame, his breath slow and controlled as he peered inside. At first it looked normal. The couch, the coffee table, the TV mounted on the wall, all exactly where they should be. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw it. The reflection. Not in the TV screen, not in the windows, but in the glass of the grandfather clock standing tall in the far corner of the room. A distorted, hunched figure, its body twisted at an unnatural angle, its arms too long, too thin, fingers curled into sharp claw-like points. It didn't move, didn't react, only stood there, barely visible in the warped glass. But the worst part, the part that sent ice rolling through his veins, was that it was facing him. Jake didn't move, couldn't. The thing in the reflection didn't move either. He knew it wasn't his. It didn't match his height, his posture. It was something else. His breath hitched, his mind scrambling for an explanation that didn't exist. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head toward the corner of the room, expecting, praying, nothing would be there. Nothing, just empty space. But when his eyes flicked back to the glass, the thing was closer. His body locked, fear pinning him in place. As the reflection shifted, the figure still impossibly twisted, still watching him. But now, it was closer to the glass, closer to him. His stomach lurched, his vision tunneling, as his brain fought to process what was happening. It was impossible. It wasn't real. But the way his skin prickled, the way his instinct screamed at him to run, told him otherwise. Then, as if it could hear his thoughts, the thing inside the glass tilted its head. The motion was slow, unnatural, like bones grinding together, the shape of it stretching and distorting, its elongated fingers twitching slightly at its sides. Jake swallowed a gasp, his knees threatening to buckle. He needed to move, needed to get out. but his body refused to obey. His mind raced through every horror movie he had ever seen, every urban legend about things in the dark, and he knew deep in his core that if he looked away, if he blinked, it would move again. So he didn't. He held his breath, his eyes burning, locked onto the glass, waiting, praying for something to happen, something to break the moment before his body gave out. Seconds stretched into eternity, the silence so suffocating it felt like the house itself had stopped breathing. And then finally the air shifted, the tension snapping like a pulled wire, and from somewhere deep in the house, from the unseen places where the darkness pooled thickest, a whisper, not words, not anything human. Just a slow, dragged breath, curling through the silence, too close to be outside, too wrong to belong in this house. And then in the reflection, the thing's mouth opened. Jake's body locked as the thing in the reflection slowly parted its mouth, an unnatural, yawning darkness stretching where its lips should have been, widening too much, too far, until it looked like it could swallow him whole. He wanted to run, wanted to rip his gaze away, but some primal instinct rooted him in place, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering like a drum against his ribs. The glass of the grandfather clock seemed to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by a breath of wind, the warped figure inside shifting, leaning forward. The thing wasn't just staring anymore, it was moving, pushing against the glass, testing the boundary between its world and his. The dim glow of the room flickered, the shadows stretching unnaturally, bending in directions they shouldn't, and in that moment, Jake swore he saw the surface of the glass bulge outward, as if the reflection was no longer content to stay inside. His chest tightened, his skin crawling as the whispering breath returned, closer this time, curling against the nape of his neck like something unseen was right behind him. He wanted to turn around. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to look, but the fear of what he might see froze him solid. Then in the reflection, the thing's head snapped to the side. Not like a normal movement, but like its neck had broken, a sickeningly sharp twist that sent a jolt of terror shooting through Jake's spine. His stomach lurched, his hands trembled at his sides, and finally, his body listened to the fear screaming through his veins. He turned and ran. His socks slid on the hardwood as he bolted back through the hallway, the dim lighting blurring as his vision tunneled, every instinct demanding he put as much distance between himself and that thing as possible. He slammed his bedroom door shut, his hand shaking as he fumbled with the lock, twisting it until he heard the click. His breath came in sharp gasps, chest rising and falling as he stumbled backward, his back pressing against the cool wall of his room. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, pressing against his ears like he had been dropped into a vacuum. No footsteps, no scratching, no rattling doorknob, just stillness. But that was worse somehow, because it meant it was still out there, waiting. His eyes darted around his room, scanning for anything that would ground him, remind him that this was his house, his space, that whatever was happening wasn't real. His monitor still glowed with the frozen screen of his unfinished game. His headset lay forgotten on his desk. His phone sat face up on his bed, the screen still open to the security feed. His heart stuttered as he grabbed it, his fingers shaking as he tapped the camera feed for the living room. The screen flickered, the pixels distorting for a second before it cleared. The couch, the coffee table, the grandfather clock, and nothing else. No figure in the reflection, no movement. The house was empty. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his muscles aching from how tense they had been. His mind struggled to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe it had been a trick of the glass, a hallucination from staying up too late, a stress-induced mirage. But deep down, he knew what he had seen, and he knew that something had seen him back. His fingers hovered over his mom's number, debating whether to call, but what would he even say? That there was something in the mirrors, that he was being hunted by his own reflection. They would think he was crazy. Hell, he was starting to feel crazy. He dropped the phone onto the bed, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to steady his thoughts. It's fine. The doors are locked. The cameras are on. It's just you here. A deep exhale, his pulse slowing, and then tap. A single soft tap against the glass. Jake's breath hitched, his stomach knotting so tightly he thought he might be sick. Slowly, as if his body moved without permission, his gaze drifted toward the mirror hanging on his closet door. and from the other side, his reflection smiled. Jake's stomach twisted into a knot so tight he thought he might vomit, his entire body locking in place as his own reflection, his own face, smiled at him from the other side of the mirror. But it wasn't right. The grin was stretched too wide, his lips curled at an unnatural angle, his teeth just a little too sharp, too wrong. His actual mouth hadn't moved. He wasn't smiling, but it was. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His chest felt constricted, like something heavy was sitting on it, pressing down, forcing him to stay still, to watch. His reflection didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at him through the warped glass with an expression that didn't belong to him. Then so slowly it made his skin crawl, it raised its hand. Jake's breath hitched, his heart hammering against his ribs, his body frozen in a state of paralyzed terror as the reflection lifted one hand, palm facing outward, like it was pressing against the other side of the glass. At first he thought it was mirroring him, mimicking what he was doing, but then he realized his own hands were clenched into fists at his sides. His breath came faster, his fingers curling tighter, his knees weak beneath him. This wasn't some illusion, this wasn't just a trick of the light. The thing in the mirror wasn't just copying him, it was trying to get out. The edges of the glass trembled, a faint ripple running across the surface like water, disturbed by a breath of wind. Jake took a shaky step back, his throat so dry he could barely swallow, his mind screaming at him to look away, to run, to get as far from the mirror as possible, but he couldn't. His body felt anchored to the spot, his limbs stiff and useless. Then the reflection's fingers twitched. Just the slightest movement. Just enough for Jake to see that its fingernails were too long, jagged and sharp, like something had been clawing at the inside of the mirror for a long, long time. Then it spoke, no sound, no voice, just the movement of its lips forming silent words. Words Jake couldn't hear but could see, the shapes of them pressing into his brain like something wet and sickly crawling under his skin. His mind fought to make sense of it, struggled to piece together what it was saying, but the more he tried to understand, the worse the nausea in his gut became. His knees buckled, he squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to move, to breathe, to break the invisible pull, keeping him rooted to the mirror's grasp. He sucked in a sharp, shuddering breath and stumbled backward, his shoulders slamming against the edge of his bed, his vision swimming with panic. Don't look, don't look, don't let it in. With every ounce of strength he had, he twisted his body, lunged for the nightstand and grabbed the nearest thing, his desk lamp. Without thinking, without hesitating, he swung. The base of the lamp collided with the mirror, and the glass shattered. A piercing, unnatural shriek erupted from nowhere and everywhere all at once, the shards raining down onto the floor like frozen rain, the sound burrowing into Jake's skull. The moment the mirror broke, the pressure in the air snapped like a rubber band, the heavy, suffocating presence vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands shaking violently as he staggered back against the bed. Silence. The mirror was gone. Shattered. The thing was gone. Jake sucked in a sharp, uneven breath, his ears ringing, his entire body trembling so hard he thought he might collapse. His heart slammed against his ribs, his vision blurring with leftover adrenaline. He forced himself to look, to stare at the broken mess of glass scattered across the floor, the twisted, distorted shards reflecting his face a dozen times over. But his reflection was normal again. No smile, no movement, just his own terrified face staring back at him. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his body screaming at him to get out of the house, to run, to never come back. But before he could even think, a click, a sound from outside his room. The doorknob, turning slowly. Jake barely had time to react before the door creaked open, revealing nothing but an expanse of black, a darkness too deep for the hallway that should have been there. And from that darkness, a hand, not human, not his reflection, something else, something that had finally found a way through. Jake's breath hitched, his chest tightening as the door creaked open, revealing nothing but a blackness too deep, too thick, like the hallway had been swallowed whole. His mind screamed at him to run, to shut his eyes, to pretend this wasn't happening, but he couldn't move, he couldn't breathe. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything except the slow, deliberate shift of something emerging from that endless dark. First the hand, pale, unnaturally long fingers curling around the edge of the doorframe, the skin stretched too tight over the knuckles, the fingernails jagged and splintered like something that had spent years clawing at a prison of glass. Then the arm, thin, almost skeletal, clothed in something dark, something that didn't move, like fabric but like shadow itself. And then, the face. No, not a face, not really, but a suggestion of one, a warped imitation of human features. The eyes sunk in black voids, the mouth stretched wide, in something too sharp, too hungry. It wasn't just stepping through the door, it was pulling itself into his world. Jake's body finally broke free of its paralysis, instinct slamming into him like a jolt of electricity. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on the broken shards of glass from the mirror, pain stabbing through his heel as he crashed onto the floor. His hands scrambled for anything to defend himself, but what could he possibly use against that? The air in the room felt wrong, heavier, thicker, like it was pressing against him, like it knew he was trapped. The thing stepped fully into his bedroom now, its body moving in jerky, unnatural motions, its limbs bending just a little too much, its form shifting like it hadn't decided what it wanted to look like yet. It didn't walk. It drifted, slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. And the worst part, the part that sent ice down Jake's spine, was that it was still smiling, that same stretched horrible grin, like it was amused by his fear. Jake's back hit the wall, his breath ragged, his fingers digging into the carpet as he tried to force his body to move, to fight, to do something. But the thing just cocked its head at him, its empty, hollow eyes, drinking him in like it was studying him, like it was memorizing him. Then it spoke, a voice that didn't come from its mouth, but from everywhere, from the corners of the room, from behind him, from inside his own skull. "You let me in." Jake choked on his own breath, his vision swimming, his heart slamming against his ribs as a wave of nausea hit him like a truck. The whisper curled around his bones, slithered through his veins, made his skin feel like it was crawling from the inside out. His body knew this thing wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to exist, and yet it did, and it was here for him. The thing took another step, its fingers twitching, its form flickering, like it wasn't bound to one shape, like it was deciding what it wanted to be. "I've been waiting," it breathed, voice stretching, warping, filling every inch of space like it had always belonged there. Jake's mind was unraveling, his pulse hammered in his throat, his limbs trembling so hard he thought they might give out completely. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to stop this. The mirror was supposed to be the barrier, wasn't it? The thing had been trapped, locked on the other side, but now it was here, standing in his room, smiling at him. And the worst part, the part that made bile rise in his throat, was that a small, terrible thought whispered in the back of his mind, a thought that felt like it wasn't his own. Maybe it had never been trapped at all. The thing leaned closer, its form flickering like static, its empty eyes locking onto him, through him, its voice barely a whisper now, curling around his skull like fingers pressing against glass. "Now let me show you what's on the other side." And then, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Jake couldn't see his hands, couldn't see the walls, couldn't even tell if his eyes were open or closed, because the blackness was absolute, thick, suffocating, pressing in from all sides like it was alive. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, his fingers digging into the ground. No, not the ground, something else, something wrong. It wasn't carpet, it wasn't wood, it was cold, smooth, and perfectly flat, like polished stone, like glass. His stomach twisted, nausea rising in his throat as realization clawed its way into his mind. This wasn't his room anymore. He had moved, or worse, he had been moved. The air was heavy, damp, charged with something unnatural, something that made his skin crawl like static electricity had burrowed beneath it, and in the silence, he could hear it, breathing, not just from one place, but everywhere, slow and rattling, curling around him, slithering against his ears, as if the dark itself was exhaling. The sound sent a spike of panic through his veins, his body jerking as he scrambled backward, his hands sliding over the slick, glassy surface beneath him. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know how he had gotten here. But something inside him, something instinctive and primal, whispered that he wasn't alone. A sound broke the silence. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. Jake's breath froze in his throat, his body locking in place as the noise continued, patient, methodical, coming from in front of him. He didn't want to look. He couldn't look. But the darkness shifted, thickening like smoke, stretching outward to form shapes, shadows flickering like static, movement that sent ice crawling down his spine. And then he saw it, a figure, tall, twisted, waiting, not in the darkness, not floating in the void, but standing in front of something smooth, something reflective, something separating them, a mirror, not broken, not shattered, like the one in his room, perfect, sheenless, solid. Jake's pulse slammed against his ribs, his fingers twitching against the glassy floor as his eyes adjusted, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. The figure in the mirror, no, the thing in the mirror, was staring at him, studying him, and it was him. Or at least it was trying to be. The shape was familiar, the outline of his body, his shoulders, his face, but it was wrong. Twisted, stretched, its limbs too long, its neck bent at an unnatural angle, its skin just a little too smooth, like it wasn't made of flesh at all, but something else. And then it smiled. Jake's stomach lurched. His body screamed at him to move, to run, but where could he go? There was no door, no hallway, no exit, just endless, suffocating blackness behind him, and in front of him, the mirror. The thing lifted its hand, pressing one long bony palm against the glass, its two sharp fingers splaying outward, nails splintered and jagged, like something that had spent years clawing at the inside of its prison. Jake's breath came in panicked gasps, his own hands shaking as they hovered inches from the surface. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't him. It was something else. Then it spoke. No sound, no voice. Just the movement of its lips forming silent words, words Jake couldn't hear, but could see, the shapes of them pressing into his mind like fingers curling through wet sand. His brain knew the words, understood them without hearing them, and the meaning sent a pulse of cold horror through his chest, freezing his limbs. Trade. Jake's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He shook his head, barely able to form the word, his voice strangled with terror. No. The thing's smile widened, its mouth stretching too far, its lips peeling back to reveal too many teeth, sharp and gleaming like splinters of glass. You already did. A crack spread across the mirror, a single jagged line running between them. Jake flinched, his pulse spiking, his body lurching backward as the surface rippled, warping like liquid. And then a hand shot through. Not his, not human. Pale, elongated fingers curled around his wrist, impossibly strong, their grip like ice, seeping through his skin, through his bones, and pulled. Jake screamed, his body jerking, his other hand scrambling against the glassy floor, searching for anything to hold on to, anything to stop himself from being dragged through. But there was nothing. No edge, no escape. The blackness behind him stretched on forever, and the thing in the mirror was winning. His body lurched forward, his shoulders slamming against the now cracking surface, his reflection flickering like a glitching screen, like a TV just barely holding onto the right channel. He could see it through the distortions, his room, his real room, his bed, his desk, the broken shards of the real mirror still scattered across the floor. He was so close. The thing's grip tightened, its fingers digging into his flesh like claws, yanking harder, its whisper slithering into his skull. It's mine now. Jake let out a strangled cry, twisting, kicking, fighting against the pull with every ounce of strength left in his body. He would not stay here. He would not let it take his place. His free hand shot forward, slamming against the mirror, and with everything he had left, he pushed. The mirror shattered. A deafening glass-sharp scream tore through the air as the world exploded around him, shards of reflective nothingness flying in every direction, cold, empty fingers ripping at him, trying to hold on, but Jake was falling, and suddenly, he hit the floor. The pain was real. The solid weight of his body was real. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs as he gasped, choking on his own breath, his lungs burning as he rolled onto his back, his limbs trembling violently beneath him. The air was thick with dust, with the sharp scent of shattered glass, and it took him several panicked, ragged breaths to realize he was back. His room. His real room. The broken mirror was still there, shards scattered across the floor, reflecting the dim glow of his monitor. The closet door was shut. The air was still. The house was silent. He had made it. He had made it. Jake sucked in a shaky breath, his entire body aching, every muscle locked with tension. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to sit up, his fingers clutching at the carpet, grounding himself. He wasn't in the dark anymore. He wasn't trapped. He was a sound behind him. A slow, deliberate tap, tap. Jake's breath hitched. His body went still. And then from the mirror shards scattered across the floor, something moved. Jake's breath turned shallow, his entire body rigid, as the sound echoed in the silence. Tap, 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 tap. His skin prickled, ice lacing his spine, as he turned his gaze toward the shattered fragments of the mirror strewn across the floor. The pieces reflected his dimly lit room. His own panicked expression fractured and multiplied across the shards, but something was wrong. The movement he had seen wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't his reflection shifting as he moved. Something inside the broken glass was still alive. His pulse hammered as he stared, barely daring to blink. A jagged sliver of mirror closest to his foot flickered, warping, bending the reflection in a way it shouldn't. And then it twitched, a slow, unnatural movement, like something was stirring beneath the surface. Jake scrambled backward, his heels scraping against the floor, his breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. This wasn't over. He hadn't escaped. He had shattered the mirror, had broken the thing's way through, but somehow it was still here. His eyes darted between the pieces, heart thudding against his ribs, the edges of his vision pulsing with raw terror. And then from the largest shard resting near his bed, a hand emerged. Not fully, not like before, but just the tips of fingers, pressing up from inside the reflection, curling against the surface, like it was trying to pull itself back through. Jake stifled a scream, his mind reeling, his body screaming at him to run, but he didn't know where to go. The house felt too small, too fragile, like the walls were closing in, like there was no escape. His fingers dug into the carpet as the movement spread through the glass, the reflections distorting, shifting, the otherworldly darkness creeping back, twisting through the shards like ink bleeding into water. The thing inside the mirror hadn't given up. It hadn't let go. It was everywhere now. His phone. He needed his phone. His shaking hands fumbled across the nightstand, nearly knocking the device onto the floor as he swiped at the screen, his breath ragged as he tried to dial. His parents? The police? What could he even say? Something came through the mirror and tried to take me. No one would believe him. He barely believed it. But then he saw it. His screen was black, not off. Just black, a flat, empty void. His reflection should have been there, faint and ghostly against the dark screen, but there was nothing. No glare of the room. No hint of his own shape. Just an empty, sucking abyss. Then the screen blinked. Jake's grip tightened on the phone as the blackness wavered, a shape forming in the depths, faint at first, then sharp, distinct, a face, his face. No, not his. The too wide grin, the hollow black eyes, the stretched, unnatural features, the thing inside the mirror. It had found another way through. Its lips moved, silent at first, forming words without sound, just like before. Then a whisper curling through the speakers like static, soft, slow, deliberate. I'm still here. Jake's body went ice cold. A scream locked in his throat as the voice slithered through his skull, its laughter blending with the flickering static, the words sinking into his bones like fingers pressing into his skin. He hurled the phone across the room, his breath ragged, his hands clutching at his head, his thoughts spinning so fast he thought he might pass out. He had to stop this. He had to end it. His eyes snapped back to the shards on the floor, his terror-fueled mind grasping for an answer, for anything that could sever the thing's hold before it crawled all the way through. Then he saw it, the largest piece of broken mirror, the edges sharp like a jagged knife. He didn't think, he just moved. Jake lunged forward, seizing the shard in both hands, the surface vibrating beneath his touch, the thing inside watching him, its reflection flickering, writhing, pressing closer like it knew what he was about to do. It opened its mouth, whether to scream, to beg, to laugh. He didn't know, but before it could speak, he slammed the shard into the floor, shattering it completely. The room screamed, a shriek of breaking glass, of something ripping apart, of a presence being torn from existence filled the air, echoing through the walls, rattling the windows. The darkness recoiled, splintering like the shards themselves, twisting back, folding in on itself like something dying. The remaining mirror pieces pulsed, then cracked, then vanished, not falling apart, not turning to dust, just gone, erased, like they had never existed. Jake gasped, his body collapsing against the bed, his heart pounding so violently it hurt. The silence that followed was thick, unnatural, pressing into his ears, making his breath sound too loud. He sat there, unmoving, waiting for something else to happen, for another whisper, another flicker of movement, but nothing came. No sound, no reflection, no presence. It was over, or at least, it should have been. Jake forced himself to stand, his limbs heavy, his muscles aching with exhaustion. His gaze swept the room, searching, scanning, his paranoia screaming at him to check again. But the mirror was gone, the glass was gone, the thing was gone. He staggered to the door, gripping the handle, his breath unsteady as he twisted it open, peering into the hallway, empty, silent, normal. He exhaled a shaky breath and stepped forward, each movement feeling surreal, like he was walking through a dream. He needed to get out of this house. He needed to see someone, anyone, to feel real again. But as he reached for the light switch, as his fingers brushed against the plastic, his eyes caught something. The reflection, not in a mirror, not in his phone, not in anything made of glass. It was in the floor, a faint, impossible shimmer, like a ripple across water, shifting just beneath the surface of the wooden panels. And for the briefest, most horrifying moment, he saw it, not gone, not broken, just waiting. Jake's breath hitched, his pulse spiked, and then beneath his feet the floor smiled. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears, his breath freezing in his throat as he stared at the impossible ripple in the floor beneath his feet. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't his mind playing games with him. It moved, shifting like water, like glass reforming itself, and just beneath that distorted surface, something stirred. His body screamed at him to run, to leap off the spot, to get out of this house now, but fear locked him in place, his muscles frozen as his mind struggled to accept what he was seeing. The ripple deepened, twisting, stretching, and then the smile widened. Not a reflection, not a shadow. A mouth stretching beneath the wood, curving up in a slow, grotesque grin, its two white teeth gleaming in the dim light of his room, lips curling in amusement, in recognition, as if the thing knew he had seen it. Jake staggered backward, his heel catching on the rug, nearly sending him sprawling, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The smile didn't move. It didn't shift toward him. It just watched, motionless beneath the warped surface of the floorboards, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. His chest heaved, his hands trembled, his mind scrambled for logic, for reason, but there was none. He had shattered the mirror. He had destroyed its way through, hadn't he? His eyes darted across the room, scanning for anything reflective, anything that could still be holding it here. His phone was on the ground, face down, the screen black, the glass shards were gone, the closet door was closed. Wait, Jake's breath hitched. The closet. His eyes locked onto it, his stomach lurching with fresh horror. He had never opened it, never checked what was inside. The thing had come through his mirror, but what if that wasn't the only way in? His fingers curled into fists, his heartbeat so loud it felt like it was shaking his skull, his mind screaming, "Don't do it, don't check, just leave, just run." But his body moved anyway, slow, deliberate steps toward the door, as if something was pulling him forward. The floor groaned beneath him, and he swore he felt something shift under the wood, something just beneath the surface, waiting. His hand hovered over the closet knob, his breath shuddering, his body bracing for something, anything, but the room remained eerily silent. He swallowed, forcing himself to move, his fingers gripping the cold metal handle. The second he twisted it, something thumped inside. Jake yanked his hand back, his stomach dropped. Another thump, heavier this time, like something slamming against the inside of the door, something that shouldn't have fit in his closet, something trying to get out. His breath came in sharp gasps, his brain screaming at him to stop, to back away, to leave it shut, but he couldn't move. The air around him felt heavier, thicker, like the walls themselves were leaning inward, like the entire house was holding its breath. And then, the doorknob twisted, not on its own, not from him, from the inside. Jake's body finally reacted, his muscles seizing as he stumbled back, his hands gripping the desk behind him for balance. As the door shuddered, rattled, something pushing, pressing against it from the other side. The floor smiled wider. The knob kept turning, slow, deliberate, like whatever was inside wasn't in a rush, like it knew he had nowhere to go. A faint, sickening whisper crawled through the cracks in the door, slithering into his ears, brushing against his brain like fingers sliding through wet hair. I never left. Jake's knees buckled. His vision swam. The air in the room warped, shifting like heat waves rising from pavement, distorting the space around the closet, stretching it, making it look deeper somehow, like the back of it no longer existed, like it led somewhere else entirely. The whisper came again, teasing, familiar, the voice that had taunted him from the mirror, from the phone, from the darkness. "You think breaking the glass stopped me?" A pause, then a chuckle, breathy and thin. "It only made more doors." Jake clenched his teeth, his nails digging into his palms, his mind spinning, every instinct screaming that he needed to get out now. His legs moved before his brain could catch up, his body lurching toward the door, not the closet door, the bedroom door, the one that still led to the rest of the house, to anywhere but here. He yanked it open so hard it slammed against the wall, his breath tearing from his throat as he bolted into the hallway, his feet barely touching the floor, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. The house was wrong. The walls stretched longer, the hallway darker, the furniture blurred like a painting smeared with wet hands. The farther he ran, the more distorted everything became, the lights overhead flickering, the air pressing down on him like a thick, invisible weight. Something moved behind him. Jake didn't look back. He would not look back. He hit the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, his hands barely grazing the railing as he careened toward the front door. It was right there, his fingers reaching for the lock, for the handle, for freedom. The door vanished. Jake's hand hit nothing, just more hallway. His stomach turned inside out, his breath ripping from his lungs as he stumbled backward, his fingers shaking as he blinked, his vision blurring from sheer terror. The door had been there. It had been right there, but now, just more warped, endless house, stretching on and on, like it had no end, no exit, no escape. The whisper came again, close, too close. "Where do you think you're going?" Jake spun, his back slamming against the wall, his breath sharp, his vision tunneling. The floorboards rippled beneath his feet, the walls pulsed, the air thick with a wrongness he couldn't describe, and from the distorted hallway in front of him, it stepped forward. No longer behind glass, no longer a warped reflection, tall, hollow-eyed, grinning. It had finally come through, and Jake had nowhere left to run. Jake's back pressed against the wall, his lungs burning as he sucked in a breath that barely felt like his own. His vision wavered, the walls around him stretching, shifting, breathing, the floor beneath his feet pulsing like something alive. The thing in front of him, his reflection, his shadow, his replacement, stood in the warped hallway, its body flickering between solid and liquid, human and something else. Its two wide grins split its face in half, teeth glinting like shards of broken glass, its hollow, depthless eyes locked onto him, with something almost amused. It had him. It knew it had him. The house was gone. The doors were gone. The walls had reshaped into something unfamiliar, something impossible, stretching into forever in all directions. No beginning, no end. He wasn't in his home anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere it controlled. The whisper returned, not from the thing's mouth, but from everywhere, curling through the air, sinking into his skin, threading through his thoughts like it had always belonged there. "You ran so far, but you were always going to end up here." Jake's breath hitched, his fingers curling into fists, his nails digging into his palms, trying to ground himself, trying to hold on to something real, something human, but nothing about this was real anymore. The house was an illusion. His escape had been an illusion. He had never gotten out. The thing took a step forward, its movement wrong, jagged, like something glitching, its limbs twitching before snapping into place. You broke the glass. Another step. You shattered the way through. Another step. But you never closed the door. Jake's chest clenched, his mind screaming at him to move, to fight. But how could he fight something that wasn't even real? Or worse, what if it was real? What if he wasn't? The thought slammed into him like a physical force, his knees nearly buckling beneath him as the thing inched closer, the walls warping, the floor rippling, his own reflection now stretching across every surface, like the entire space was made of mirrors, his face staring back at him 1,000 times over. But they weren't copying him, they weren't him. Every reflection moved on its own, twisting its mouth into an expression that didn't match his, turning its head when he hadn't moved, shifting, whispering, laughing. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath shallow, his body screaming to wake up, wake up, wake up. But there was no waking up from this. He had let it in, he had broken the barrier, and now it was taking its place. The thing stopped inches from him, its hollow, glassy eyes peering into his, its grin never fading. We don't need two of us. Jake's stomach lurched, his body lurching to the side just as the thing's fingers shot toward him, unnaturally long, stretching, reaching, its form flickering like a corrupted screen as it tried to grab him. He moved, ducking, pushing off the wall, sprinting blindly into the shifting space, his feet pounding against the floor. The hallway stretching ahead of him, reshaping as he ran, doors appearing and vanishing, walls twisting into corners that led to nowhere. His body burned, his mind a hurricane of panic, of escape, escape, escape. But the laughter chased him, the whisper curling through the air like invisible fingers brushing against the back of his neck. There is no out, there is no out, there is no out, there is no out. A door, it was there, ahead of him, flickering in and out of existence like a dying light bulb, a final, desperate chance at something, anything. Jake didn't slow down. He threw himself forward, his hand latching onto the knob, twisting, pulling. The door opened, and he was falling, not onto the floor, not into another hallway, but into something cold, something weightless, a void stretching into forever. His body spiraling down, 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 light and shadow warping around him, reflections of himself breaking apart, shifting into something not him, faces he didn't recognize, things wearing his skin, things waiting for him on the other side. His scream tore through the nothingness, but there was no sound here, no air, no escape, just endless, endless falling, and then, impact. Jake's eyes snapped open. He was on the floor, his room, his bed, his desk, the broken shards of the mirrors still scattered across the carpet, his phone lying face up next to them, the screen dark. His chest rose and fell in rapid, ragged gasps, his body trembling, his mind scrambling to understand. Had it been a dream, a hallucination, a breakdown? His fingers pressed against the carpet, feeling it, grounding himself. Real, this was real. The room was silent, the house was still. He had made it. He was back. Slowly, shakily, he pushed himself up, his limbs heavy, his head pounding. His eyes flickered to the mirror shards, reflecting nothing but the ceiling, fractured and harmless. He swallowed hard, forcing down the bile in his throat, reaching for his phone, needing to see the time, needing proof that he was really here. The screen flickered as it came to life, the familiar glow almost comforting. 1:34 a.m. Exactly when it had all started. Jake's stomach twisted. He slowly turned his head toward his closet door. It was shut. The air was still. No whispering, no movement, just silence. He let out a breath, shaky but controlled. It's over. A click. His heart stopped. The closet door creaked open. Jake's body refused to move. His breath caught in his throat. The darkness behind the door was thick, endless, wrong stretching deeper than it should. The back of the closet missing, just a yawning abyss that pulsed, watched, and then a whisper, soft, familiar, trade. The doors slammed shut, and Jake finally screamed.